So we've covered the right stories for the right media when it comes to the national and the local and regional media. So now I wanted to focus on the trade press. So when it comes to trade, it's basically when it's business to business and industry specific press. That's essentially what trades are. So they're not aimed at the consumer public. They're aimed at people that would be interested in reading these publications to get an industry understanding. So the majority of businesses I work with, even if they've got an element of consumer facing service or products, they still have trade media targets. So if you're a law firm, for example, you might have trade publications that you want to be getting into. If you're an accountant's firm or a business services firm and your key clients are other businesses, again, you might want to get into specific publications. If, for example, you're a business coach or you're a stress specialist or you work essentially with other businesses and work with the HR departments of other businesses, again, you might want to target certain trade publications like the HR press in your sort of country where you're from, or even some trade press online. Now, a note with this course, I'm focusing on trade here. Trade isn't just print press anymore. The world has changed. There's lots of online publications that are aimed specifically at particular industries. However, I'm focusing on trade magazines for this and trade publications because I am going to go on to online media as a whole separate part of the course, because I think that's something that you want to dedicate a certain amount of time and knowledge to. So with the trade, as I mentioned, I've already given you a few examples of the kind of publications that could work for your industry, and here is the kind of things they look for. So whatever the trade publication, whatever the industry, one thing that separates them clearly from the local and the national consumer press is that the trades can be technical. So with that, if you recall, and if you've seen the previous element of the course where I talk about the stories that work for the local and regional media, one of the examples I show you is of a new CT scanner that's been set up and launched at a hospital. So the CT scanner that was featured in the regional publication, the angle we went with was the fact that we'd invited the local mayor, and we took a really nice picture of the mayor with the executive director peering through the scanner, and the fact that it would help people who suffer with claustrophobia and who really struggle to be in tight spaces because it's a slightly wider scanner. That's about as technical as we got, and generally the focus was the fact that we had invited the mayor and it was a great boost for the hospital, therefore a great benefit to the local community. The same story was pitched to the trade media, and the angle we went with was nothing to do with the mayor because the trade press frankly aren't interested. They want to know the facts. Okay, so it's a new scanner. So the example trade magazines that we targeted is a magazine called Rad Magazine, which is about radiology. So they wanted to know the spec of the scanner, what type of scanner it was, what were the benefits. So the fact that it was a wide bore, so it helped with claustrophobia, the fact that it helped with overweight patients, those were the kind of things that they were interested in, and they really wanted to get down to the nitty-gritty technical aspect. So think about what kind of stories you might have in your business. If you've got a product launch or if you've got a service launch, would it be relevant to trade publications? Do you know the trade publications in your media? Quite often I go into sort of smaller law firms and accountancy firms, and they have the standard, the lawyer, the standard publications on their coffee table. What do you have? What's in your industry? What are people reading? Have a look and think about where you could fit in. But one thing I can guarantee is if you look at the trade publications, you will find that they are a lot more technical because they are aimed at a already captive and educated audience. So it's assumed that the audience of a trade magazine will know have a certain level of knowledge about what you're talking about or the story you're pushing. So, like I mentioned about the fact that the CT scanner story, Rad magazine already knew what a scanner was. They didn't need it spelt out. They needed to find out what it would mean, what type of scanner it was, and what it would do. Local and non-national stories could work. So by that I mean, again, the example I previously mentioned about the scanner, it was a local story, but it also worked as a trade story. So that story didn't have legs as a national story. It wasn't groundbreaking. The scanner wasn't the first of its kind. We couldn't make any big claims like that. So it wasn't a national story, but the point I'm making here is trade publications by and large are often national, if not international. They don't have geographical boundaries that local and regional stories do. So with that in mind, what I'm trying to say is your local story might not have legs for a national consumer publication, but it could get into trade. And the beauty of getting into a trade publication is it goes far and wide to your target audience. So one of my other clients, they're in aviation, they're a small aviation recruitment firm. And essentially, I've got them into certain aviation specific publications. And it's a huge amount of gravitas towards their peers. And the beauty of that is, while trade might have smaller circulation, certainly than a national, and often smaller publication numbers and circulation figures than a regional, however, it's targeted because people read these publications because they're interested in industry news. So it's something definitely worth thinking about. So, for example, if your business is selling eco-friendly and allergen-free baby products, as an example, you'd get yourself into the consumer media because you want other mums to read about it. But think about this. Think about what's new about the innovation, what's new about the technology involved, what's new about the ingredients, what publications would be interested. Are there vegetarian specific publications? Are there specific retail publications? Are there other ways to get to your stakeholders beyond the consumer media? So that's where it's worth thinking when you've got a local story. If it's specific to your trade, it might be that you can get 2 bites of the cherry. You'd have to tweak it slightly differently, which is what we're going to talk about. But essentially, your story could go beyond just being a local story, and it could reach nationally without getting into sort of the big national papers. Okay, so I don't think I need to say too much about this because I've kind of covered this area, but essentially, as I say, it has to be relevant to the specialty. So if it's Plastics and Rubber Weekly, which is very, very technical, you have to have something of relevance to them. So with my aviation client, the publications are only interested in aviation-based stories, and even within those publications, sometimes it's a particular area of aviation. So for example, it might be aviation security, which is a publication in itself. It might be airline business, which is all about the business of aviation. Or it might be more technical, an aerospace publication. So do take care and attention to get a copy of the publication, whether it's physical or whether it's online. Read over a few stories and just familiarise yourself and just see whether you can add something to that specialty or whether you can tailor your story to that specialty. Okay, so often trade publications, I thought this is worth mentioning. Not always, but quite often, trade publications prefer an exclusive angle, and this is because trade publications are few and far between, and they don't really often go for the blanket catch-all press release. They would need it tweaked to them. This isn't to say that you have to constantly rewrite your press releases to fit the trade, to fit the local, but sometimes tweaking an angle, tweaking the top line, making an element of it exclusive to them certainly gives you more advantages. So I'll give you the example of my aviation client, and we got them in airline business because we gave an exclusive angle on an opinion piece. Another example with the same client in aviation was that we did a story which was all about the business of running airlines from an airport's perspective, but we also then pitched the story from the pilot's perspective to a very specific publication called Pilot Career News. So it's often that if you can even just get a top line to them and say, this is why it's relevant, and I can offer this angle exclusively and give you an exclusive quote, they'll be quite interested to hear more. Okay, so again with trade, longer articles can often work quite well because for all of the aforementioned, you can afford to be more technical, you can afford to make it more relevant. So sometimes, I mean, with a press release, like I say, don't worry, we're going to go into a lot of detail on press releases and how to craft them, etc. But as a general rule, press releases shouldn't go beyond 1 page because otherwise it just gets far too long. With trade, often they're quite interested in longer angles, and this goes back to the exclusivity bit. So you might, for example, when I've worked in architectural or buildings press, I've got in touch with, so for example, you're a small architectural firm, you're a small group of house builders, or even, builders that work with corporate office space, for example. I've in the past gone to those publications that are niche and said, and looked on their website or looked in the magazine and said, oh, I notice you've got a section on eco-friendly buildings. Can I pitch this angle to you? And that's the bit I mentioned, giving them an exclusive angle, giving them something that someone else hasn't got before. And often they'll come back and say, that's great, can you do 500 to 800 words? Which of course is way beyond the traditional press release, but they have capacity for it. And to be honest, if you do pitch and a publication says, can I get 500 words or 800 words, I wouldn't be daunted, I would be ecstatic, because the more coverage they devote to you, the more chance it is of your brand getting out there and really resonating with your target audience. So yeah, longer articles tend to work with these trade magazines because they want to go into detail and they often like an exclusive. A little note about colour separations. So this might not be relevant to you depending on your industry, but I just wanted to cover all bases because, as I've mentioned previously, this course is aimed at any small business in any industry. It should be relevant and you should be able to learn how to do PR from it. So one thing to mention, colour separations, if you don't know, is essentially it's like an advert. It's a paid for piece that comes off the back of a press release, and some trade publications only take paid for articles. So it's something to bear in mind that they're essentially called colour separations, and often, and when I started out in PR and I was very green, I didn't quite realise what it meant because I was always brought up on the view that, or trained on the view that, if your story's good enough, it'll get coverage. However, certain industries, it's particularly prevalent in property and construction and buildings and architectural. But a lot of their publications, they can't afford to keep printing stories for free. The only way of survival is through charging PR companies and businesses for their articles. So often you'll know this if they come back to you and say, we love the story, we've got a certain amount of space and we can do you a deal. It's £100 or $100 to get into this publication and have 300 words, for example. So essentially, it's an advert, but don't be daunted about it sort of being, the PR isn't good enough. Some publications only do colour separations, and like I say, it's relatively common in trade. I've got plenty of coverage without, but like I say, without having to pay for it, but certain publications will only take colour separations, and as you go in this journey, you'll get to realise, you'll get to know them and be familiar with them if they're in your industry. Like I say, it might not affect you, but I wanted to just put that out there because, it may be relevant to your business. Okay, so the other thing is they might have more forward feature opportunities. So a forward feature is essentially, a lot of journalists, they work to a calendar. So The obvious example that I think a lot of people know is that Vogue have a September edition that everybody wants to be in, and that's the one that they really work towards. However, it's not always with trade publications. It's not always just one in the year, but they might have a calendar of things. So for September, for example, the architectural press, they're going to cover eco buildings. For October, they might be covering buildings on a budget, and for November, they might be covering the more high end and high spec and more aesthetic buildings. So thinking about it like that, often trade publications, they may well have forward feature opportunities, and quite simply it's a case of picking up the phone and asking them, do they have a list of forward features of what they'll be working on over the next 6 months or over the next year. And the beauty of that is they'll probably be happy to send it to you, and if they do, you can see what opportunities they have and put your hat in the ring and say, I've noticed in April you're doing something about affordable homes. Well, I actually am a builder and I work on affordable homes, so could I put an article forward on XYZ, whatever your exclusive angle is? And, if it works for them, you've secured yourself a piece of coverage. So this is probably, one of the most different areas of PR compared to the local and national. And as I've detailed, a lot of the areas are they don't cross over. They don't cross over with local or national just because they want to be technical. They want an exclusive angle. The type of articles are often different, but very valuable nonetheless. If you've got publications that you can target and if you can get into them, because it's a home run, you've got into publications that your audience will be reading.